A breathtaking announcement at which the Climate Change Commissioner, Dr. Roderick Carr, was there. There were sundry BlackRock investors flown in from the United States of America. And Chris Hipkins, the Minister for the Environment in Auckland, made the call yesterday that there was going to be a spectacular commitment with the wind behind us, and if everything's going all right, and if we hold our breath the right way, to 100% renewable energy. The day previous to that, the government had announced fast-track consent processing for some of the renewable energy projects in New Zealand. One of them that is chaired and overseen by our next guest, Craig Stobo, who we have on, as you know, as a regular economic and political commentator. And he is chair of New Zealand Windfarms. He got the green light. I'll actually draw Craig into the conversation now. Craig, welcome to the show. When I got that on Monday, mate, I texted you, as you know, and said, well done, Craig, you've got fast-track consent. You said, oh, this is old news.
Yeah, and it doesn't apply to us. So we've got a consent for our existing wind farm a few months ago, and we've also been referred by the Minister to the Environmental Protection Agency for consideration of another consent, but that's not news to us. And the news announced when you called me was for three wind sites that have got through the first stage of consent, which is to get the Minister of the Environment, David Parker's approval to progress on the basis that they fulfil the criteria in the Act, in the Fast Track Consenting Act. So those three and the solar potentials are only in the first stages of going through the consent process. So these were ones that applied before the cut-off date for the end of the fast-track consenting criteria, which finished in early July. So it's not particularly new news, and it's not actually a project yet because they haven't got the consent through the EPA. So it's at the very early stages of the process.
So you mentioned, Craig, how expensive it is to go through a consenting process in New Zealand to get renewable energy projects like ones that you look after through. And you mentioned, I think at some stage, God, Michael, it can take 6-7 years and millions of dollars. What's the aim of fast track? Is it's not going to take that long, but it's still going to take a lot of money?
It takes less money and less time. So in our case, for the first consent that we got for the Te Rere Hau wind farm in the Manawatu behind Palmerston North, it took us 21 months under fast track. Now that's still far too long in my book,
yeah,
but it's considerably faster than the old slow track. And the difference is the Minister being a funnel for approvals, and then the EPA process is just sped up considerably. It has sort of the same constituent actors, but there are very clear timelines to get stuff done, which is helpful. And I would like to think that this fast-track process can continue, but not just for renewable energy, but for any other consenting projects of size. And I don't know what cut-off it would be, but it's much more efficient.
Yeah, but it doesn't guarantee you get consent, though, does it? It just means that the process is sped up.
Correct. So you still can have appeals and delays, for example, or not approved. And then you've got to build something after that. You're still going to dig something, start the project. So it's ambitious to making the kind of renewable rollout that the Minister's expecting by 2030. That's just, in my book, just very challenging.
I know you're being diplomatic. Yesterday there was... which is you, Craig, to be fair. I mean, you were a diplomat, so you still use that language. Yep. Others of us would say it's just crazy. Now, yesterday, though, another one of our old mates from university, Rod Carr, was sitting on the stage or standing beside the Prime Minister when this BlackRock announcement was made. Yep. You know a lot about BlackRock investment, you know a lot about international diplomacy, you know a lot about renewable energy. What's your assessment of that announcement yesterday?
Well, I've just got the press release in front of me. I just want to work through that with you to give you my take on what actually happened. So the first bullet point from the Prime Minister and the Minister of Energy was that government and BlackRock work together. And I don't think that's a deal. That's the wrong word. All that has happened, when I look at the outcome, is BlackRock starting a $2 billion infrastructure fund focusing on renewable energy in New Zealand.
Mm.
It's not more capital, because the capital was still there the day before. It might be redirected into New Zealand projects. The goal of 100% renewable electricity generation is unrealistic. And I'm sure Rod Carr might have been squirming in his seat because there's been a difference of opinion on what the efficacy of getting to 100% when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine and the lakes are low. You don't want brownouts. You're going to need some sort of base load, and at the moment the preference of the industry overall, I think, is probably gas. So I'm not sure I agree with the Minister around that target. That's unrealistic and possibly idealistic. The third sort of bullet point is the fund will accelerate green energy options. But that's not true. The fund will fund opportunities, but those projects are the targets of the investment. The acceleration, in the Minister's words, will require sites, equipment, consents. And that's not BlackRock, that's the government and the EPA process. So I don't agree with that bullet point. In terms of having access to greater pools of capital, BlackRock is already in New Zealand. It's used by ASB for their unit trusts and KiwiSaver scheme. The New Zealand Super Fund uses BlackRock for their fixed income investments. This firm has been part of our landscape for some time. To claim that somehow there's some sort of coup by bringing them in to New Zealand by the ministers is somewhat creative, I would have thought, Michael.
Mm. Okay, well, that's a very interesting assessment, and as usual, well informed, and you know the background to it because of your own personal, professional background, Craig. Which leads me to the next bit here. At the moment, the polls would suggest that there may well be a change. So if you're a betting man, you'd say probably 70-30 that there's going to be a change of government in October of this year. Lots of time to go before that. It may reverse that particular trend. But if that happens, Craig, now you as a business person planning ahead, election or regime changes is part of what you plan for. What would you expect anything to change in this area for the 3 years after the election?
I'd like to consider that a new regime would retain the fast track process in some shape or form. That we axe on flow, so that's
oh yeah, it's got to go. That's crazy stuff. That is, yeah, I agree.
Well, to me it's a very large government on-off switch that controls the price of power at a point when the government thinks prices are too high, and I just think that discourages long-term investment. And we've got better ways of thinking about storage, battery storage, than a very expensive lake. I think we'd also need to explore ways in which we can think about new technologies and how we can use them, and conservation measures. So getting energy closer to people's homes, whether that's solar roofs or energy sites closer. And I want to put on the table again my view that we shouldn't discount nuclear.
I agree.
Why should we not discount? Why should we discount it? I think that's a head in the sand approach.
Yeah.
We should consider that as a base load, as a green base load solution, with a small nuclear reactor close to where we need it, which is probably the upper North Island. So that's something that should be considered and debated by our society.
Oh, I totally agree with you. It's really interesting that as we talk to you now, the coalition, it's the Liberal Country Coalition across the Tasman, Craig, I'm sure you're aware of this, are now talking of a coal to nuclear transition as part of their centrepiece of their energy policy for 2025. Does that make sense, do you think, here too?
Yeah, well, yes, I do. There's announced this morning that the government's put out a 3-month energy policy consultation paper. So in three occasions this week, we've had energy discussion papers coming out from the Crown. And in that, they're looking at a public-private body to coordinate hydrogen development. Yeah, okay. And then legislation to ban baseload fossil fuel generation. which I find incredible. Why would you ban a source of fuel that you might need at some point to prevent brownouts for our people? I just don't understand that.
No, we've got zealots in charge. Where does this policy come from? Does it come from Cabinet, or is it coming from senior policymakers in Wellington?
I don't know the answer. I've only seen the policy, the consultation announcement this morning, so I haven't got more detail. But it's come from government, but I don't know how it got to an announcement stage.
Now, you and I know Rod Carr, who's the Climate Change Commissioner. We know Rod well. We went to university with him. We were in debating teams with him. We know he's a very, very bright man, but he is a linear thinker. So it's one step in front of another. And if he's been given a job to do, he's going to go in a linear fashion to get there, and he's going to call you out when you step off that path, which is pretty much what he's done, actually, as Climate Change Commissioner. I don't see an awful lot of creativity, though, coming out of the Climate Change Commission. I don't see them coming up with anything other than you're not doing it properly, get back on track. Do we need to actually extend their powers so that they can think about things like nuclear?
I'm not sure that they can't think about that. They certainly have put out their recommendations for how the emissions trading scheme should work, and the government declined to listen, then suddenly stopped being deaf and reinstated the scheme. I'm sure there's been debate between the Commissioner, Rod Carr, and ministers around, base load, the realism of going from 84% renewable electricity generation to 100%. And I'm sure that he's discussing with them the fact that only 40% of ultimate consumer or industrial users of power use electricity. We still have 60% of our energy use is non-electrically driven. So will he be worried about our ability to get to 2030 and meet those emission reduction targets? Yes, I think he will be. He will be banging the table saying we're not going fast enough, and therefore we will end up having to pay the price of buying European credits to offset our gross emissions failure. And he has been on record of saying, what's your number? What is the number you're going to reduce your emissions by? So he's not been hiding behind a bush. He's been very clear about the pace. And the ministers seem to be coming out with statements that look like they're accelerating the pace, but when you carefully analyse the press releases, that's just not the case.
No, good analysis. Hey, we've talked a lot about, you and I, about Craig, the transition and the equity issues involved. It's really interesting because at the moment there's a screaming as we all go to fill up our car or our van or whatever with petrol or diesel. That $3 is going to be in the rear vision mirror soon, $3 a litre, and that's causing significant equity issues already right now, today, for middle and lower income households throughout New Zealand. As the rubber meets the road on that issue, and as we know that petrol and electricity prices are likely to rise after December as a result of the emissions trading scheme and the auction scheme and things like that, and that flows through the economy as well, is there an end point that you think where the politicians go, we're going to change the goalposts because it's just causing too much pain?
Yeah, there's sort of three markets in there. So there's the fuel market, which is driven by the overseas price of oil and shipping costs and government taxation on fuel. There's the carbon markets and the emissions trading scheme, which are driven by other factors. And then you have the price of electricity, which is, again, a market that is separate. But all three sort of have dependencies. I have been quite vocal in discussing the trade-off between what the politicians call a just transition, which I think is an attempt to describe fairness, which is incredibly difficult to allocate efficiently across different parts of our population, and the costs of getting to the transition. So somebody has to pay for the transition. It doesn't come out of thin air, and usually that comes down to one of two groups: users, which are the polluters of emissions or the users of energy, or the second group is taxpayers. And rapidly, as we get closer to 2030 and realise that we can't get there, the impost of the transition is going to fall on taxpayers to pay for those European credits to offset our gross emissions failure. And so we all end up losing from not having behavioural changes by emitters and by users. But yes, it's a critical piece of discussion for our society. If we want to get to 2030, we're going to have to pay for it. Somebody has to pay.
Well, can we just change the goalpost? Say, we'll get there by 2040 instead, which I think the Australians have done.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. We can exercise our rights under the Paris Agreement to opt out of some issues like food security. So we can say, credibly, I think, if we wanted to have that conversation globally, look, we're an efficient food producer and exporter. People around the world need our food. The transition doesn't make sense for food security reasons. We can stop the entry of agriculture into the ETS, which is a topic of conversation that the national parties already had regarding delaying the entry issue. There's also a piece that's come out in the science world through IPCC, which is the group that opines on, the pace of change and climate change on a science basis. And they have come out in the last couple of weeks saying that the effect of methane on climate's been overstated. And I think the number is something like 3 or 4%, but it's not been discussed in our press. And you would say to yourself then, well, the seriousness of methane is not what it was based on the science in the IPCC. So there's one angle there. To walk away from Paris altogether, I think would be difficult. But there may well be nations around the world who face the same issues as us, that we can't get there by 2030. So we all hold hands and we move to 2035, for example. Otherwise, you face these costs. And if people have to pay the costs because that's what we want as a society, that's fine. But it's not free.
Well, you know me, I tend to head towards the conservative politician line, which is why are we leading the pack? Because at times when New Zealand has led the pack in the past, particularly on policy innovation, we've often been left to freeze in the cold. Are we in that sort of position here, do you think, as well?
Well, we are a tiny emitter globally. China is the largest emitter at about 30%, although on a per capita basis, America is higher. So while China's rapidly rolling out renewables, they're also building fossil fuel generated power stations. They and the US are the greatest contributors to the emissions issue. So working with them to reduce their output is important. To do that position of strength is where you would want to demonstrate that you are making the effort to get there and trying to encourage China to do the same. So we're tiny in the scheme of things. And we will pay a lot.
Well,
we'll pay a lot to get there.
Well, I was just going to say, Craig, you're the diplomat. The chance of New Zealand sitting down with China and convincing them to do the right thing is not very high, is it?
No, but you're in a worse position if you're not making an effort to get there yourself, isn't it? So it's a credibility issue, sitting around a table. But absolutely, China needs energy for its people, clearly, and their choices may be more constrained than ours. We're luckily endowed with a climate that enables rain to fall and the hydro lakes to fill, and we have land to put solar and wind farms on. We're fortunate.
Okay, now, and that's the next question for you. There are wind farms being, I think, apart from the ones that the government was talking about, there were 2 further ones, I think, down Southend as well. Is there a stage that we get to peak wind farm in this country? I mean, we are a very windy country at the end of the day. The westerly blows across the Tasman. It's pretty easy to generate the stuff, you would think. But is there a point at which the public say enough?
If you don't want brownouts, I don't think so. You'll recall that NZ Windfarms is investing a considerable amount of our retirement income investments into investigating offshore wind farms below the Taranaki Bight in conjunction with Copenhagen investment partners who are a consultant in this area. That is a massive project with giant wind platforms in the windiest part of our North Island west coast. I suspect there'll be more of those being looked at around the country. They're not easy to build, they're not cheap, but the scale of the project is massive. So I don't think we've finished this journey at all yet, given where consumption of electricity is as a percentage of total energy only sits at 40%. We've still got some way to go to transition to a higher use of electricity in our energy. So the demand for renewable energy continues to rise as the transition continues. So I don't see a peak in it yet. There will be consenting issues, NIMBY issues. I don't want that in my backyard. But the alternative is brownouts or failure to reach Paris, and a huge taxpayer cost when we buy these European credits.
And finally, you are in an area, I mean, I know you're an innovative thinker, you're an entrepreneur in your own right. Your companies are leading companies, Craig. You make electricity from the wind. Is there any idea that you as a company will move into alternative energy sources using the electricity you generate? I was thinking particularly of, say, something like green hydrogen or something like that.
It's always actively discussed at investment and energy forums. The technology is still evolving. It's still challenging. We will not be a leader in that space ourselves. We've got more opportunities to provide and invest in more wind farms as a generator before we get into alternative energies. But it may well be that we partner with organisations that need renewable energy in order to make green hydrogen, which is hydrogen that's being created by the use of renewable electricity. So yes, happy to look at partnerships and those sorts of ideas, but we won't be investing in that area directly at this stage in our company's development.
All right. Craig, thank you very much. You always put everything into its perspective. I thank you for your time. Nice to have it. And have a good rest of the week, mate.
Thanks, Michael. Stay warm.
Okay, thank you. Yes, stay warm. All right, that is Craig Stobo, Chief Executive of Windfarms. You know all his pedigree and background. The government have used him, successive governments, to head anything from tax reform to a range. We're very, 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 very lucky to have him on the platform and his knowledge and his expertise. Interested, and he's not scared about having an opinion, is he? He's one of our business leaders who I think, thank God we've got them as business leaders, just be quietly.